When the galaxy's most arrogant species gathered to mock humanity's primitive mythology, they had no idea they were about to meet the monster from those very legends and discover that humans weren't the prey in those ancient stories. What started as academic condescension turned into a masterclass in why you should never, ever underestimate the species that taught the universe's apex predator the meaning of fair play. Before we continue the story, if you're new here, make sure to subscribe to HFY Havoc, hit the bell, and like this video. Because if you want more epic HFY sci-fi stories like this one, you don't want to miss out. Tonight, we're diving into a tale where diplomatic immunity becomes a matter of life and death, and where humanity's greatest strength isn't our weapons or our technology. It's our ability to make friends with things that should terrify us. Let's see what happens when the predators realize they've been mocking the wrong species all along. The observation deck of Neutral Station Kappa 7 offered a spectacular view of 3 different nebulae, which made it the perfect location for beings who preferred to look at anything other than each other during diplomatic functions. Ambassador Thrixeval of the Hegemony had chosen his spot near the reinforced viewport specifically because it positioned his back to the wall and gave him clear sight lines to every entrance. Old habits from his military days, he told himself, though the truth was that retired generals made terrible diplomats precisely because they never stopped thinking tactically. "Oh, this is rich," announced crystalline entity designate Velnoth, her voice resonating through the translation matrix with what passed for amusement among the Kithera. The Mockery actually believed their creators lived inside their planet's core, inside molten rock, the thermal dynamics alone. "At least our creation myths don't involve cosmic serpents eating their own tails," rumbled Gorthak, the Veltar delegation's lead xenobiologist. His species had perfected the art of looking perpetually annoyed, which served them well in academic circles. Your people's obsession with cycles borders on mathematical neurosis. The gathering had started as a routine cultural exchange, the sort of bureaucratic necessity that kept different civilizations from accidentally declaring war over misunderstood dinner invitations. Somehow, as these things often did when academics were involved, it had devolved into a competitive mythology tournament. Each species seemed determined to prove that everyone else's ancestral beliefs were more ridiculous than their own. Thrixeval found the whole exercise tedious, but he kept his opinions to himself. Military observers were supposed to observe, after all, not participate in intellectual pissing contests between crystal formations and oversized lizards. He was more interested in the human representative, who had been sitting quietly in the corner for the past hour, occasionally taking notes on a primitive paper tablet, while everyone else gestured at holographic displays. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves looked exactly like what Central Casting would order if they needed unremarkable human scientist. Average height, brown hair pulled back in a practical knot, the kind of face that disappeared in crowds. She wore the standard diplomatic uniform that managed to be both formal and completely devoid of personality. Everything about her screamed harmless academic, which Thrixeval found suspicious for reasons he couldn't articulate. "The truly fascinating aspect," Velnoth continued, her crystalline form catching the nebula's light and scattering it in prismatic patterns, "is how primitive species always invent predators more dangerous than themselves. Compensation mechanisms, obviously." "Elaborate," requested Zefektar, the junior Mockery cultural attaché. Her species resembled what humans might generously call upright starfish, though they'd evolved past the need for water breathing approximately when Earth's continents were still arguing about their final positions. "Simple psychological projection," Velnoth explained, with the tone of someone delivering wisdom to particularly slow students. "Species that evolved as prey animals invariably create mythological super predators. It's their way of processing generational trauma. Gorthak snorted, a sound like grinding stone. The Veltar have no such myths. We evolved as apex hunters. Our legends celebrate the hunt, not fear it. How refreshingly honest, said Dr. Reeves. Her voice was quiet, but carried clearly across the room. Everyone turned to look at her, some with surprise that she'd finally spoken, others with the polite attention reserved for academic colleagues. You disagree with our analysis, Doctor? Reeves? Velnoth's tone carried just enough condescension to make it clear she considered human input adorable, but ultimately irrelevant. Not at all, Reeves replied, setting down her pen. I was simply admiring the elegance of your framework, though I am curious about something. Thrixiville noticed that she didn't actually say what she was curious about, instead letting the silence stretch until someone else felt compelled to fill it. Interesting technique. Please, share your thoughts, Zephiktar encouraged, her species being naturally inclined toward inclusivity, even when discussing the intellectual shortcomings of other civilizations. Well, Reeves began, I was wondering how your framework accounts for cultures that have myths about predators who hunt other predators. The room fell quiet for a moment. Even the ambient hum of the station's life support seemed to pause. Elaborate, Gorthak said, unconsciously echoing Zephiktar's earlier request. Humanity has numerous legends about creatures that specifically target what you might call bad predators, Reeves explained. Entities that hunt the hunters, but only certain kinds. They follow codes, make distinctions, choose their prey based on behavior rather than mere opportunity. Velnoth's crystalline structure flickered, the Kythera equivalent of a dismissive laugh. Wishful thinking elevated to mythology, prey species fantasizing about cosmic justice. Perhaps, Reeves agreed mildly. Though it raises questions about the psychological framework you mentioned. If humans evolved as prey animals, why would they imagine predators that might protect them? Wouldn't the compensation mechanism work in reverse? Thrixiville found himself leaning forward slightly. The human had a point, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why it bothered him. Simple answer, Gorthak declared. Your species never developed proper predator instincts. You invented imaginary ones to fill the gap. Classic overcompensation. Fascinating theory, Reeves said. Would you like to hear one of these myths? I think it might illustrate your point perfectly. The assembled delegates exchanged glances. There was something in her tone that didn't quite match her words, though none of them could identify what exactly felt off. By all means, Velnoth said. I'm always interested in primitive folklore. Dr. Reeves closed her notebook and set it aside. When she looked up, Thrixiville noticed her eyes held a quality he hadn't seen before. Not quite amusement, not quite anticipation. Something else entirely. This particular story comes from multiple human cultures, she began. Independently developed, which anthropologists find curious. It concerns a being that exists in the spaces between civilizations, hunting according to an honor code most species would find counterproductive. She paused, as if considering her words carefully. The entity only appears when certain conditions are met. It's drawn to worlds or locations with high concentrations of what humans call worthy prey, beings who have proven themselves as skilled hunters or warriors. But here's the interesting part. It doesn't simply eliminate them. It studies them first, tests them, and sometimes... Another pause. The nebulae outside the viewport seemed to shift colors, though that was probably just a trick of the station's rotation. Sometimes it finds individuals or species that remind it of itself, not in terms of capability necessarily, but in terms of philosophy. When that happens, the hunting stops, at least for those particular beings. Zephiktar's appendages twitched in what might have been nervousness. You speak as though this mythology has contemporary relevance. Dr. Reeves smiled, and for the first time since the meeting began, Thrixville felt the old military instincts kick in. Something was wrong. Not dangerous exactly, but wrong in the way that made veteran soldiers check their weapon charges and scan for exits. "Oh, I wouldn't call it mythology," Reeves said softly. "I prefer to think of it as cultural documentation." "Documentation implies record-keeping," Velnoth pointed out, her tone sharp enough to cut through the growing tension. "Your species barely achieved interstellar travel 2 centuries ago." "Records can be inherited," Dr. Reeves replied, settling back in her chair with the casual comfort of someone preparing for a long conversation. This particular entity first made contact with humans approximately 12,000 years ago. Cave paintings in what you'd now call the Australian continent show remarkably detailed depictions of a figure that shouldn't exist according to any terrestrial evolutionary model. Gorthak's massive frame shifted with obvious skepticism. "Coincidence. Primitive art often exaggerates proportions." "True," Reeves acknowledged, "though these particular cave paintings show technological details that wouldn't be invented by humans for another 11 millennia. Thermal imaging, cloaking devices, energy weapons. Quite sophisticated for simple exaggeration." The human's clinical delivery contrasted strangely with the increasingly fantastic nature of her claims. She spoke like someone discussing grocery lists rather than impossible technologies depicted by Stone Age artists. "Assume for argument's sake that these encounters actually occurred," Zefektar said, her natural diplomatic instincts attempting to keep the conversation constructive. "What would be the entity's motivation? Surely not simple hunting behavior." "Competition," Reeves replied without hesitation. "The entity appears to exist in a state of perpetual self-improvement through conflict. It seeks out the most dangerous beings in any given region and tests itself against them. Victory brings technological advancement, presumably through study of conquered opponents." Thrixville found himself taking mental notes despite his initial dismissal of the conversation. The human's description bore uncomfortable similarities to certain classified military reports from the Outer Rim territories. Incidents involving missing ships, destroyed outposts, and survivors who spoke of impossible encounters before psychological evaluation deemed them unfit for further testimony. "Your timeline is problematic," Velnoth interjected. 12,000 years would represent significant technological stagnation for any advanced species. Evolution doesn't pause. "Who said anything about evolution?" Reeves asked. "The entity doesn't appear to be a natural organism, more like a sophisticated artificial construct with adaptive capabilities. It learns, upgrades, incorporates new technologies and techniques from each successful encounter." She reached for her water glass, taking a sip before continuing. The simple gesture somehow felt theatrical, as though she were buying time to consider her next words carefully. "Human encounters with the entity follow predictable patterns. Initial contact involves observation periods lasting weeks or months. The entity studies potential targets, cataloging their capabilities, weapons, tactics, social structures. Then comes the testing phase." "Testing how?" Gorthak demanded. "Elimination of peripheral targets, friends, colleagues, anyone the primary subject might call for assistance. The entity prefers isolated opponents, you see. Fair contests without external variables." The temperature in the observation deck seemed to drop several degrees. Thrixville checked his suit's environmental readings, but everything showed normal atmospheric conditions. "This begins to sound less like mythology and more like a behavioral profile," he observed, speaking for the first time since the conversation began. Dr. Reeves turned to look at him directly, and her expression held something that might have been approval. "Military background, Ambassador?" "Formerly. Your description matches certain unexplained incidents in contested territories." "Ah, Reeves nodded, as though this confirmed something she'd already suspected. The entity seems particularly drawn to conflict zones, concentrations of skilled warriors, advanced weaponry, competitive violence, like a researcher seeking optimal test subjects. Velnoth's crystalline form had been flickering with increasing frequency, a sign of agitation among her species. You speak of this creature as though it currently exists. Present tense, active behavior patterns. Interesting observation, Reeves said. I suppose I do. Professional hazard of studying contemporary subjects rather than historical ones. The room fell silent except for the barely audible hum of station systems. Zefektar's appendages were rigid with tension, while Gorthak had assumed what his species considered a defensive posture. Even the typically unflappable Velnoth seemed off balance. Contemporary subjects, Thrixivil repeated slowly. Dr. Reeves, what exactly is your field of specialization? Xenoanthropology, with a focus on predator-prey relationship dynamics in multi-species environments, she answered promptly. I study how different civilizations interact when placed in competitive scenarios. And this entity you've been describing represents the most successful example of adaptive predation I've encountered in my research. She glanced around the room, taking in each delegate's obvious discomfort with what appeared to be mild academic interest. It's particularly fascinating because it doesn't follow standard biological imperatives. No territorial claims, no resource acquisition, no reproductive drives, just pure improvement through opposition. Where? Velnoth asked, her voice tight with barely controlled alarm. Did you conduct this research? Oh, various locations, Reeves said airily. Hegemony military outposts, Veltar hunting preserves, Cathara research stations. The entity has quite an extensive operational range. Thrixivil felt something cold settle in his stomach. Several recent intelligence briefings had mentioned unexplained incidents at exactly those types of facilities. High-security installations going dark. Distress signals cut short. Investigation teams finding empty buildings with no signs of struggle. You're describing attacks on military installations, he said carefully. Attacks? Reeves tilted her head as though considering the word. I suppose that's one interpretation, though field studies might be more accurate from the entity's perspective. The overhead lighting flickered once, briefly, before returning to normal. Station Kappa 7 had some of the most reliable power systems in the neutral zone. Equipment failures were virtually impossible. Dr. Reeves, Zefektar said, her diplomatic training finally overriding her growing alarm. I think it would be beneficial if you clarified the nature of your research. Are you discussing theoretical scenarios or documented events? Oh, documented, certainly, Reeves replied. Though I should mention that documentation can be tricky when your research subject prefers to avoid leaving witnesses. She stood up, moving to the viewport to gaze out at the swirling nebulae. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality. Not clinical anymore, but something that might have been personal experience. The entity has very specific rules about witnesses, you see. Generally speaking, it prefers clean elimination of all observers. But occasionally, it makes exceptions. Usually for beings that demonstrate particular qualities it finds intriguing. Thrixivil's hand moved unconsciously toward his sidearm before he remembered that weapons were prohibited in the neutral zone. The gesture didn't go unnoticed. What kind of qualities? He asked. Before Dr. Reeves could answer, the station's emergency klaxons began screaming. Red warning lights bathed the observation deck in pulsing crimson, while automated voice systems announced hull breach protocols in 17 languages simultaneously. All personnel to designated emergency stations. Unknown intruder detected. Security teams to alert status Omega. This is not a drill. The assembled delegates reacted according to their species' typical crisis responses. Velnoth's crystalline form immediately dimmed to reduce visibility, while her internal structure reconfigured into defensive geometric patterns. Gorthak roared a challenge at nothing in particular, his predator instincts demanding immediate action despite having no visible target. Zefektar began rapid calculations on her personal device, seeking statistical probabilities for various catastrophic scenarios. Thrixaval moved to the nearest security console, his military training overriding diplomatic protocol. "Station systems show massive power fluctuations," he reported. "Something's interfering with our sensors. I'm getting energy signatures that don't match any known technology." Dr. Reeves remained exactly where she'd been standing, gazing out at the nebulae with apparent calm. Her lack of panic struck everyone as either remarkably brave or disturbingly inappropriate. "Shouldn't you be seeking shelter?" Zefektar asked, genuine concern overriding species differences. "From what?" Reeves replied without turning around. The question hung in the air like a poisonous gas. Outside the viewport, space itself seemed to shimmer with heat distortions, despite the vacuum's inability to conduct thermal energy. "Security feeds are coming online," Thrixaval announced, manipulating holographic displays with practiced efficiency. Intruder bypassed all external defenses. No ship, no vehicle signature, no entry vector. It's like something materialized inside our hull. "Where?" Gorthak demanded. "Deck 7, Section C, moving through residential quarters." Thrixaval's voice grew tighter as he processed the incoming data. "Wait. Multiple contacts now. Deck 5, Deck 12, Deck 3. How is that possible?" "Single entity with rapid transit capability," Reeves said conversationally. "Probably using the ventilation shafts and maintenance corridors, much faster than traditional corridor navigation." Everyone stared at her. The clinical tone had returned, as though she were providing academic commentary on a research project. "You seem remarkably well informed about intruder tactics," Velnoth observed, her voice resonating with suspicious harmonics. "Pattern recognition," Reeves replied. "This behavior matches documented infiltration techniques from my research." Thrixaval felt pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. "Your research subject, the entity you've been describing." "Oh yes," she confirmed pleasantly. "Right on schedule, actually. Though I must admit I'm curious about target selection protocols. Station Kappa 7 hosts an interesting variety of species representatives." The security feeds showed movement in the corridors, but the visual data made no sense. Thermal signatures appeared and vanished without corresponding mass displacement. Motion detectors triggered in sequence, tracking something that cameras couldn't resolve properly. "It's hunting," Gorthak said with grim recognition. A lifetime of predatory experience gave him insights the others lacked. Systematic elimination pattern, testing defenses, cataloging responses. "But hunting what specifically?" Zefektar asked. Before anyone could speculate, the security feeds began showing actual casualties. The station's defensive personnel were encountering something that dismantled their formations with surgical precision. Weapons fire illuminated corridors briefly before cutting off abruptly. "Military targets first," Thrixaval noted with professional detachment. "Security teams, armed personnel, anyone with combat training. It's neutralizing threats before moving to secondary objectives." "Secondary objectives being?" Velnoth's crystalline structure had shifted into full defensive configuration, her body resembling an angular fortress more than a living being. "Unknown," he admitted. Dr. Reeves finally turned away from the viewport, her expression thoughtful, rather than frightened. "Actually, target prioritization tends to be quite logical once you understand the underlying psychology." She moved to the security console, studying the tactical displays with obvious familiarity. See here? It's avoiding certain sections entirely. Civilian quarters, medical facilities, maintenance areas with non-combat personnel. This isn't random violence. Then what is it? Thrixval asked. Quality control, she replied simply. The lights went out completely for 3 seconds before emergency power restored minimal illumination. When the security feeds reactivated, the intruder's location had shifted dramatically. Deck 15 now, Thrixval reported. Command level. It's moving toward critical systems. Or critical personnel, Reeves suggested. A new alarm joined the cacophony, this one specifically indicating threats to the command structure. Station Kappa 7's senior staff were either dead or incapacitated, leaving automated systems to manage the crisis. We should evacuate this section, Zephyctar said with admirable calm. Emergency pods are accessible from the adjacent corridor. Inadvisable, Reeves said firmly. Movement would only draw attention. Better to remain stationary and avoid triggering additional interest. Additional interest from what? Gorthak roared, his patience finally exhausted. From a hunter that has spent the last several minutes systematically eliminating everyone on this station who poses a legitimate threat, she replied, with the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to slow students. The temperature dropped again, this time measurably. Frost began forming on the viewport despite the station's environmental controls, maintaining atmospheric pressure and humidity within normal parameters. That's impossible, Velnoth stated. Thermal regulation systems can't fail that selectively. They're not failing, Reeves said. They're being overridden. The entity generates significant heat signature disruption when preparing for close quarters engagement. Local atmospheric cooling is a side effect of its cloaking technology. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the distant alarms and the barely audible hum of failing life support systems. Then the emergency lighting cut out entirely, plunging them into absolute darkness. In the blackness, something that sounded like electronic breathing filled the room. Emergency lighting flickered back to life, revealing a figure that shouldn't have been able to fit through the observation deck's entrance. 7 feet of biomechanical perfection stood motionless near the sealed doorway, its form suggesting evolutionary design principles that no known species had ever achieved. The entity's head turned with mechanical precision, scanning each delegate with sensors that glowed like dying stars. When its gaze settled on Dr. Reeves, she nodded politely, as though greeting a colleague in a university corridor. Gentlemen, ladies, distinguished representatives, she said with bureaucratic formality. I'd like you to meet my research partner. Velnoth's crystalline structure had locked into complete stasis, her species' ultimate defensive response to overwhelming threat. Gorthak remained frozen in a half-crouch, every predatory instinct screaming contradictory commands about fight or flight responses. Zephyctar had simply collapsed into a geometrically perfect sphere, her appendages retracted completely. Only Thrixval maintained any semblance of military composure, though his hands shook as he tried to access his sidearm before remembering its absence. Partnership, he managed to say through clenched teeth. You're working with this thing. Thing? Reeves looked genuinely offended. Ambassador, that's hardly diplomatic language. This is a sophisticated intelligence with cultural achievements spanning several millennia. The entity made a sound like grinding metal mixed with digital static. Somehow the translation matrix rendered it as laughter. Your species finds humor in fear, it said, its voice carrying harmonics that made everyone's bones ache. This trait was unexpected. Humans have always been peculiar about threat assessment, Reeves replied conversationally. We tend to anthropomorphize dangers rather than simply fleeing from them. Anthropomorphize? The entity's head tilted with bird-like curiosity. Assign personality characteristics to impersonal forces. Makes them easier to understand, negotiate with, potentially befriend. She gestured towards the cowering delegates. Most species view you as a natural disaster with agency. Humans see you as a person with interesting hobbies. Thrixval found his voice despite the existential terror. Hobbies. You're calling systematic murder a hobby. Selective elimination based on merit evaluation. The entity corrected with what might have been pride. I do not kill indiscriminately. Only those who demonstrate sufficient skill to warrant my attention. And the others? Zephyr whispered from within her defensive sphere. Irrelevant, like insects beneath notice. Dr. Reeves moved closer to the entity, completely ignoring its lethal potential. See, this is where human psychology becomes useful. We understand the concept of worthy opponents because we invented sports, competition for its own sake, rather than survival necessity. The entity's sensors focused on her with obvious interest. Your species engages in artificial conflict scenarios. Constantly. We even pay to watch other humans compete in structured violence, boxing, martial arts, gladiatorial combat with safety regulations. She smiled with genuine warmth. We're probably the only species that would see your hunting behavior and think, what an interesting challenge, instead of, how do we eliminate this threat? This is insane, Gorthak growled, finally finding his voice. You're discussing genocide like it's entertainment. Not genocide, the entity said with mechanical precision. Selection. I preserve genetic lines and cultural achievements of worthy prey through combat integration. Their skills become mine. Their knowledge joins my database. They achieve immortality through contribution. Absorption, Velnoth managed to whisper. Collaboration, Reeves corrected. The entity doesn't simply steal techniques, it studies them, improves them, applies them in new contexts. Every encounter makes it more sophisticated. She turned to address the assembled delegates directly. Do you understand now why humanity was invited to join galactic civilization despite our supposedly primitive development? We weren't brought in as junior partners or client species. The terrible truth began settling over the room like toxic gas. You were brought in as bait, Thrixval said with dawning horror. As partners, Reeves corrected again. The entity had been hunting through this galaxy for approximately 3,000 years before making contact with Earth. It had encountered dozens of species, absorbed countless technologies, refined its capabilities to near perfection. The entity moved closer to the viewport, gazing out at the nebulae with what might have been appreciation. Most civilizations follow predictable patterns. Flee, fight, hide, surrender, evolutionary responses to superior predation. But humans, Reeves continued, did something unprecedented when first contacted. We invited it to dinner. Dinner, Zephyr repeated faintly. Cultural exchange protocols, Reeves explained. We assumed it was simply another species with different customs. When it demonstrated hunting behaviors, we offered to show it human hunting techniques. Persistence tracking, endurance challenges, cooperative pack strategies. And it was fascinated, the entity added. No species had ever offered instruction rather than resistance. More than that, Reeves said with obvious pride. We offered improvement suggestions. Humans have been perfecting killing techniques for 60,000 years, but we've also been perfecting the ethics of when not to kill. Rules of engagement, laws of war, concepts of honorable combat. The entity's sensors shifted to focus on each delegate in turn. Other species fight for resources, territory, dominance. Humans fight for principles. Which brings us to current circumstances, Reeves said, settling back into her chair as though the conversation were resuming after a brief interruption. The entity followed standard protocols upon arriving at Station Kappa 7. Elimination of potential threats, assessment of worthy opponents, preparation for quality testing. But you were here, Thrixivil said with growing understanding. Human presence indicates protected status, the entity confirmed. Partnership agreements specify non-interference with diplomatic activities. Velnoth's crystalline structure began reforming into normal configuration, her terror slowly being replaced by academic curiosity. You're saying this creature honors treaties? Treaties, agreements, codes of conduct? Reeves nodded. Turns out that after 3 millennia of hunting, it was getting bored with simple predation. Humans offered something more interesting. The concept of fair play. The entity made its grinding static laugh again. Fairness, arbitrary limitations that increase challenge difficulty rather than ensuring victory. Fascinating concept. So now, Reeves concluded, instead of hunting for survival or dominance, it hunts for sport, with rules, and occasionally with teammates. She stood up and moved to stand beside the entity, looking absurdly small next to its biomechanical bulk. The galaxy's apex predator chose humanity as its favorite hunting partners, because we're the only species that could teach it the difference between killing and murder. Outside the viewport, the nebulae continued their ancient dance, unchanged by the revelation that 2 of the universe's most dangerous predators had just decided they rather liked each other's company. The entity turned toward the remaining delegates, its sensors evaluating each one with new criteria. Partnership protocols remain in effect, it announced. Diplomatic immunity extends to current gathering. Then, almost as an afterthought, though future encounters may proceed differently, Dr. Reeves smiled at the room full of silent, terrified alien representatives. Anyone else want to discuss mythology?